It's 1978. Somewhere in the Soviet Union, a man boards a train. He looks like a schoolteacher. Quiet, thin, awkward, glasses slightly too large for his face, a worn briefcase tucked under one arm, the kind of man people instinctively ignored. No one on that train pays him any attention. No one ever did. Over the next 12 years, this man would murder at least 52 people. Children, teenagers, young women. He would do it in forests, in fields, near railway stations, in the long strips of trees planted along Soviet roads to stop the soil from eroding. Those forests had a name, Lesopolosa, forest belts. They became his hunting grounds. This is the story of Andrei Chikatilo, the most prolific serial killer in Soviet history, and the case that exposed the cracks in an empire that claimed to have no crime at all. To understand what Andrei Chikatilo became, you have to understand where he came from. He was born on October 16, 1936, in a small village in Soviet Ukraine. The timing could not have been worse. Ukraine in the 1930s was in the grip of the Holodomor, a man-made famine that killed millions. Chikatilo grew up in a world of starvation, fear, and death. His mother told him repeatedly that his older brother Stepan had been kidnapped and eaten by neighbors during the famine years. Whether this was true or a product of trauma and wartime hysteria, investigators would later debate. But Chikatilo never forgot it. That image of a child consumed lodged itself somewhere deep inside him, and it never left. He was a poor student, not because he lacked intelligence, but because he was nearly blind and too poor for glasses. He struggled to read the blackboard. He was mocked by classmates. He wet the bed until he was a teenager, something that humiliated him deeply in the communal living quarters that Soviet families shared. He wanted to study law in Moscow. He failed the entrance exam. He wanted to find a wife. When he finally did marry in 1963, he discovered he was impotent in the traditional sense, a condition that would shape the rest of his life in ways no one could have imagined, and that he would spend decades hiding behind the mask of an ordinary Soviet man. By the late 1970s, Andrei Chikatilo was 41 years old. He lived in Shakhty, a mining town in southern Russia in the Rostov region. He worked as a supply clerk, traveling constantly between factories and warehouses across the region. His job gave him something invaluable, legitimate reasons to be anywhere. No one questioned a supply clerk at a train station in a city 300 miles from home. He had a wife, 2 children, an apartment. From the outside, a completely ordinary Soviet man. From the inside, something had been building for decades. In December 1978, it finally broke through. Her name was Lena Zakotnova. She was 9 years old. On December the 22nd, 1978, Chikatilo lured her to a small shack he had secretly rented near the Grushevka River in Shakhty. What happened inside that shack, we know from his own confession, given years later. He attacked her, and in doing so, he discovered something that would seal the fate of dozens more victims. Violence, for Chikatilo, replaced what he couldn't achieve any other way. He strangled Lena Zakotnova and threw her body into the frozen river. A witness had seen him with the girl near the shack. Police investigated. Chikatilo was questioned and released. There wasn't enough to hold him, but the case didn't disappear. It sat unsolved, gathering dust. Years later, in 1983, under mounting pressure to close the file, investigators targeted a local man named Alexander Kravchenko. He had a prior criminal record. He fit a rough profile. Under pressure, a confession was obtained. Alexander Kravchenko was convicted of Lena Zakotnova's murder. He was executed in 1984. He was innocent. Chikatilo had killed again long before Kravchenko was even arrested, and he would not be stopped for another 7 years. Between 1981 and 1990, Andrei Chikatilo murdered at least 51 more people. The victims were diverse, but they shared certain patterns. Most were approached near railway stations or bus stops. Many were runaways, homeless teenagers, or people traveling alone. Some were young women. Some were children as young as 7. He used his job as cover. He traveled constantly. And he used the Lesopolosa, those long man-made forest belts running alongside Soviet railways and roads, as his killing grounds. Remote enough for privacy. Close enough to transport links to disappear from quickly. Some victims weren't found for months, buried under leaves, hidden in undergrowth, swallowed by the same forests that Soviet planners had built to protect the land. There is one detail from this period that investigators found deeply disturbing. Chikatilo returned to the sites, not immediately, but weeks, sometimes months later. He would go back to the forests, stand where it had happened. Investigators who interviewed him extensively afterwards believed he did it to relive the experience, to revisit something he couldn't let go of. The forests remembered what the Soviet state refused to acknowledge. The Soviet Union in the 1980s was a country that officially had no serial killers. Serial murder, in Soviet ideology, was a Western problem, a product of capitalist decay and moral corruption. The USSR, built on socialist principles, had supposedly eliminated the conditions that created such monsters. This wasn't just propaganda for public consumption. Many investigators genuinely believed it. When bodies began appearing in the forests around Rostov, mutilated, bearing the same signature wounds, local investigators struggled to connect them. There was no national criminal database. Information didn't flow freely between regions. A murder in one district might never be connected to one 50 miles away. There was also something else: the pressure not to find a serial killer. Admitting that a maniac was operating freely across Soviet territory would be an ideological embarrassment. Careers could be destroyed not just by failing to catch a killer, but by suggesting one existed in the first place. So cases were filed separately. Evidence was lost. Leads were ignored. One investigator, a senior detective named Isa Kostoyev, began to suspect the truth as early as 1982. He compiled records. He noticed patterns. He pushed for a coordinated investigation. He was sidelined. The murders continued. By the late 1980s, the investigation had become one of the largest and most expensive manhunts in Soviet history. It had a code name: Operation Lesopolosa, the Forest Belt Operation. Police checked train tickets at dozens of stations, conducted mass blood testing of male citizens across the Rostov region, interviewed hundreds of thousands of people, and still, the killer kept moving freely through the system. The operation's tactics became increasingly desperate. In the forests and at the stations, thousands of plainclothes officers worked round the clock, and in one of the stranger chapters of Soviet law enforcement history, male operatives dressed in women's clothing, wearing wigs, walking the railway platforms as decoys, hoping the killer would approach them. They were trying to catch a ghost. In 1984, police set up intensive surveillance at railway stations across the region. On September 13th of that year, one of those officers noticed Chikatilo behaving suspiciously at Rostov train station, approaching women, watching, moving on. He was brought in. His bag was searched. Inside, a length of rope, a knife, petroleum jelly. He was questioned for hours, and then his blood type came back from the lab. The forensic evidence from the crime scenes indicated the killer had blood type A. Chikatilo's blood test showed type AB. They didn't match. The officers released him. Here is where the Soviet system failed in a way that is almost impossible to overstate. The phenomenon of secretor anomalies, where certain biological markers in secretions don't reflect a person's standard blood type, was known to science. It was documented. It was not a mystery. But the blood test on Chikatilo's sample in 1984 was conducted carelessly. The analysis was botched, either through negligence, a mislabeled sample, or simple Soviet bureaucratic indifference to precision. When the same biological evidence was re-examined years later, after his arrest, Chikatilo's secretor profile matched the crime scene evidence exactly. He had been in custody. He had been released because a laboratory worker hadn't done their job properly. This was not a failure of science. It was a failure of people, of a system that had learned to cut corners, to rubber stamp results, to treat procedure as a formality. He walked out of that station, and he killed again within weeks. By 1990, a psychiatric profile had been commissioned, something almost unheard of in Soviet criminology. A psychiatrist named Alexander Bukhanovsky had spent years constructing a portrait of the likely killer, an older man, educated, sexually dysfunctional, outwardly unremarkable, capable of sustaining a completely normal life in parallel with his crimes. The profile was filed, and it waited. On November 6, 1990, police received a report of a suspicious man near the Donleskov's forest station. He had mud on his boots. He was sweating in cold weather. There was a red smear on his cheek. Officers stopped him, took his name, Andrei Chikatilo, supply clerk, Shakti. They let him go. But this time, his name went into the system. And this time, an investigator connected it to the 1984 railway station incident. A surveillance team was assigned. On November 20th, 1990, Chikatilo was observed approaching a young woman near Novocherkassk station. That same day, the body of his final victim, 22-year-old Svetlana Korostik, was found in a nearby forest. She had been killed 8 days earlier. On November 20th, 1990, Andrei Chikatilo was arrested. He was 54 years old. He had been killing for 12 years. The interrogation lasted 9 days before Chikatilo spoke. What finally broke him wasn't pressure or tactics or the weight of evidence. It was Alexander Bukhanovsky, the psychiatrist who had written the profile years before he was ever a suspect. Investigators brought Bukhanovsky into the interrogation room not as an interrogator, but as something rarer, a person who wanted to understand. He sat across from Chikatilo, and he began to read. He read Chikatilo his own psychological portrait, the document he had written years earlier, before anyone had a name for the killer. He described the man's childhood, his humiliations, his dysfunction, his inner world. Chikatilo listened in silence, and then he began to cry. He looked at Bukhanovsky and asked quietly, "How do you know all of this about me?" After that, he talked for days. He confessed to 56 murders. Investigators could verify 52. He walked officers through crime scenes, drew maps from memory, described victims with a precision that left investigators shaken, not just by the detail, but by the strange, shifting quality of his emotion. One moment, something that resembled remorse. The next, a flat, clinical detachment that was somehow worse. The trial began in April 1992. By then, the country Chikatilo had lived his entire life in no longer existed. The Soviet Union had collapsed in December 1991. The man who had grown up dreaming of studying law in Moscow, who had wanted so badly to be part of the Soviet system, to belong to its institutions, to rise within its structures, now sat in a metal cage in a post-Soviet courtroom in a country called the Russian Federation, being tried under laws inherited from a state that had ceased to exist. There is a particular irony in that. A man shaped entirely by one world, judged by another. Victims' families screamed at him from the gallery. Some had to be physically restrained. The cage had been built specifically because authorities feared the crowd would tear him apart if given the chance. Chikatilo responded with strange behavior throughout the trial, singing, shouting, muttering incoherently, exposing himself. His defense argued mental incompetence. The court-appointed psychiatrists disagreed. Chikatilo, they concluded, understood exactly what he had done. He had planned. He had evaded. He had maintained a functional life for decades. He was legally sane. He was found guilty of 52 counts of murder. On February 14, 1994, Valentine's Day, Andrei Chikatilo was executed by a single gunshot to the back of the head. The standard method: clean, bureaucratic, Soviet in its efficiency, even after the Soviet Union was gone. He was 57 years old. In the years that followed, the Chikatilo case forced an uncomfortable reckoning. An innocent man had been executed for his first murder. Police had held the real killer in custody in 1984 and released him because of a botched lab test. The system had, at every turn, prioritized the appearance of order over the reality of investigation. The ideology that said serial killers couldn't exist in socialism had been allowed to shape and to blind the people whose job it was to catch one. His victims ranged in age from 7 to 45. Many were among the most vulnerable people in Soviet society: runaways, the homeless, children traveling alone. People the system had already failed once before Chikatilo ever found them. They deserved to be found sooner. They deserved better than a state that was more concerned with its own image than with their lives. The Chikatilo case is studied today in criminology programs around the world, not just as a story of one man's violence, but as a case study in institutional failure, in how ideology distorts investigation, in how the pressure to maintain a certain image of society can allow a killer to move freely through it for over a decade. It's a story about a monster. But it's also a story about a system that made space for him to exist. And behind the Iron Curtain, there were many more files like this one, sealed, classified, waiting to be opened. This has been Red Files. If this story stayed with you, subscribe, because there are more files to open. New case. Next week, the case of Andrei Chikatilo is documented in Soviet and Russian court records, psychiatric evaluations, and the investigative accounts of Isa Kostoyev and Alexander Bukhanovsky. The execution of Alexander Kravchenko for Chikatilo's first murder remains one of the most sobering failures of Soviet criminal justice. Red Files does not glorify violence. These stories are told to remember the victims and to understand how such crimes were allowed to happen.